I'm Patrick Watson. I'm an astrologer, and you're watching 12 different types of Aries Rising. So right now we're going to look at Aries Rising with Mars in Pisces, the 12th house. So let's take a look at the 12th house. I call the 12th house the house of wondering, uncertainty, and peril. So the 12th house is typically considered to be a more bad house, more bad. It is a house associated with enemies, isolation, solitude, prison in some cases, as well as strangers. And there's a few different reasons for this. But if we go back to diurnal motion and zodiacal motion, we can see that the planet in the 12th is a house which has already passed the ascendant and is now on its way out. So a planet is in the 12th is moving towards the horizon by zodiacal motion, but is overcome by diurnal motion. The Earth's turn guarantees it will be taken away from the first, and it can never quite get back. So this is why I say that a house in the 12th house can be lost. It doesn't mean that they can't achieve anything. It means that they can sometimes stray from the regular course or stray from their intended purpose. They can kind of get lost, and that planets in the 12th house kind of stray. You may have noticed that all of the cadent houses are all associated with travel, long distance traveling or short distance traveling, and so the 12th house is getting lost, traveling but not necessarily knowing where. It's sort of unknown. It's also an unseen house by the ascendant. The ascendant does not make a classic aspect to the 12th, so it's kind of unaware. There's a sense of ignorance about this house. Since Saturn joys in the 12th, that sort of gives the 12th some of its Saturnian significations, like being a place of solitude and isolation, or being in prison, being confined. But Saturn also joys in the 12th in the sense that, the only response to kind of the uncertainties of life or of getting lost is to be careful, to cultivate Saturnian virtues of prudence and caution. And you can also see how the 12th is kind of an opposite of the 6th, because in the 6th, a planet is trapped in the 6th. It can't get out. Whereas the 12th is also not in a good situation, but instead of being trapped in a confined role or space, a planet in the 12th is lost and wandering. It can't find its way back home, to the horizon. So, because when a planet strays out and it doesn't know necessarily even where it's going, this can expose someone to vulnerabilities, and this is why the 12th is related, I think, to weaknesses and downfalls, because this is when enemies or strangers can be able to take advantage of you, is when you are in a sort of more vulnerable or weakened state. So that is the 12th house. Let's see what it means for Aries risings now. So, for Aries risings with Mars in Pisces in the 12th house, I like to call this the Ronin, the Rebel, and the Martyr. So this is going to be someone who's characterized by their forceful engagement in areas related to suffering, solitude, and tragedy. Their tendency to stray beyond safety, or alternately to put themselves aside for a greater purpose. Someone who can be vulnerable to enemies and betrayals. This is one of the less common ascendant ruler combinations in the Northern Hemisphere due to the short ascension of Aries. Didn't correct that typo. And because Pisces is one of the least common signs for Mars to be in, but just by a little. So, let's see what this actually means in practice. Errol Flynn is, he was this famous, swashbuckling actor who was also pretty troubled. He was born with Aries rising, with Mars and Pisces 12th, and in his youth he was a chronic runaway. He was very rebellious and adventurous. He was expelled from multiple schools, and he spent the next few years as a vagabond, traveling on the high seas, So, I mean, automatically we can see from his youth that, this is a guy who was going places, but not necessarily knowing where, he was going. And often in a Mars-like fashion, right? Going nowhere quickly. He was captured on camera jumping into crocodile-infested waters, which again seems like another pretty on-the-nose description of Mars and Pisces in the 12th. But this was impressive enough to people that he was offered an acting job, and it kind of led to his career in acting. And he became famous for portraying these sort of strapping, heroic swashbucklers like Robin Hood, who are also kind of Mars and Pisces in the 12th type figures as well. He had a lot of unfortunate things happen to him as well. After that, his image was really tarnished when he was rejected from the military in World War II due to health problems, which was kind of funny because he's supposed to represent. I think it's a bug. He was supposed to represent, this ideal of, masculine athleticism, as is Aries, typically does, but he had these health problems that stopped him from fighting, so it kind of tarnished his image a bit. And he also got into trouble sleeping around, especially with women who were too young. And he was charged with statutory rape. And so that, again, we can kind of see Mars getting himself into trouble, like going way too far with something. And we can see, Venus is in conjunction with Neptune trine Mars, so we might be able to see how that sort of plays into his how his amorous instincts got him into trouble as well. Towards the end of his life, he fell into drugs and a very self-destructive lifestyle, which the 12th is also associated with, self-destruction, which tarnished his image further. And he died at sea on his boat at 50 years old with his 17-year-old girlfriend at his side, which is so not okay, but ew. All right. So that is Errol Flynn. Kind of became his own worst enemy in some ways, with the ruler of the ascendant in the 12th, and someone who just strayed too far, from the course that he had in life. But it's not all hopeless, okay, guys? Because I'll show you. People can be successful with these positions. It just depends. So, Che Guevara, he was this revolutionary martyr, I guess you could say. He was born with Aries Rising and Mars and Pisces in the 12th, and he was kind of this countercultural symbol of rebellion. And what's interesting about that is, he was born with Uranus rising in Aries, just like James Dean was, and he has also become this kind of charismatic, iconic figure, with this kind of signature, and this photo in particular, the what is it called, the Guerrilla Heroico or whatever, this heroic picture, like it seems to describe, this Uranus rising on the Aries and Mars in Pisces in the 12th kind of constellation of meanings. Anyway, so remember how the 12th is sort of has a traveling component to it? So a motorcycle journey as a medical student awakened him to the suffering in South America, which he saw as a result of capitalism, leading him to embrace armed revolt. So he was exposed to... So the 12th house is suffering, right? And has a Saturnian kind of meanings, being isolated. And he went on this, motorcycle journey alone and saw these people suffering, and that was kind of what put him on the road to becoming, the Che Guevara. We also know he had some very typical Mars-type attributes as well. He was a successful athlete. He was also, Pisces ruled by Jupiter as well, and he was very well-read. He was quite an intellectual man. And, with Mars straying from its home sign, he also embraced a broad use of the death penalty and of death and violence in general, for his aims. And, he became iconic in death. And what's really interesting is a lot of people are saying now that, Fidel Castro technically betrayed Che Guevara. He had a contingency of soldiers that he could have sent to help him in Bolivia, but didn't. and Che Guevara didn't have much nice to say about Fidel Castro in his later years. So it's interesting to consider because he, the 12th house is supposed to be about enemies as well, and so part of, his story, is how he was sort of portrayed by Fidel Castro. He became iconic in death, executed by Bolivian soldiers. I thought this was a great quote from Dr. Peter McLaren. He said, "Rebel, martyr, rogue figure from a picaresque adventure, savior, renegade, extremist, in which there was no fixed divide among them," talking about opinions about Che Guevara. "The current court of opinion places Che on a continuum that teeters between viewing him as a misguided rebel, a coruscatingly brilliant guerrilla philosopher, a poet warrior jousting at windmills, a brazen warrior who threw down the gauntlet to the bourgeoisie, the object of fervent paeans to a sainthood, or a mass murderer clothed in the guise of an avenging angel whose every action is imbricated in violence, the archetypal fanatical terrorist." And that I just think that's a perfect distillation of regardless of whether you like Che Guevara or not. I'm not saying whether I do or not, because honestly I'm not sure, because I don't know, I don't know. So what I can say is that with Mars ruling the ascendant and placed in the 12th, that this was a guy who definitely manifested that position in kind of his the overall impression he's left from his time on Earth. Gordon Brown was a former UK Prime Minister, and he was born with Aries Rising, with Mars in the Pisces 12th, and he suffered an injury in rugby as a youth that nearly made him blind. And he's actually suffered great personal tragedies, especially with his children, which is interesting because, he has the ruler of his 5th house in the 12th house as well. And so one of his children died days after being born, and actually that baby was also born with Aries Rising and Mars in Pisces 12th. So I don't know what to make of that, but it's just kind of strange that they both had the same ascendant and the same ascendant ruler. One of the main things that I think that sort of comes through for him as far as being a very 12th housey guy is he declined to seek the Labour leadership in 1994 in a notorious agreement, the Grenada Pact, made between him and Tony Blair. Basically, Tony Blair said that he would, Gordon Brown said that he would forego becoming Labour leader in exchange for broad policy powers in government, and that Blair would only serve till halfway in his second term and resign and appoint him as Prime Minister. But instead, Blair betrayed Brown on this agreement, and he only stepped down during a third term. And while they were publicly political partners, they were bitter rivals privately, especially after Blair reneged on the agreement. And so in a sense, Brown kind of subjugated his own potential, his own promise at a good political career, in order to make way for Tony Blair, who only took advantage of him and only kind of betrayed him. And he only got to be Prime Minister for 3 years under appointment, until he was forced to resign. It was was not a glorious run, and he really probably should have had a more positive or lengthier role as Prime Minister, but it just didn't turn out quite that way. He'd given up too much of himself before he finally got the chance to be Prime Minister. So I think it shows how the 12th deflects away from the ascendant. So maybe if he'd had Mars and Aries, he might have sort of latched on to a position of leadership, wouldn't have ceded to Tony Blair, but kind of Mars strayed from its home, and Mars strayed from the ascendant, and that was him, Mars straying, and he ultimately didn't serve his own purposes. He was deflected away from his own sort of central anchor of his own wants and wishes and identity. So and it was kind of summed up by this quote from this guy, William Underhill. He said, "If Gordon Brown made enemies, his own temperament may have been the worst." So it sort of shows again how, people who have the ascendant ruler in the 12th can sometimes be their own worst enemies, or, act in ways that give their enemies space. So, next we're going to be looking at ways to tell the difference between people with ways to look at the ways to individuate Mars as an ascendant ruler.